Hey, remember the times when people actually gave a shit? Those were good times. Those were the times where anime based on MMOs existed, and sometimes were at the very least not vomit-inducing. And now look where we are. We're making stories about MMOs because, I don't know, Japanese writers like to refer to menus and such. Sometimes this whole notion of virtual MMOs feels like a weird and lazy cop-out to implement RPG mechanics into an otherwise typical fantasy story. Continuing the trend of the most generic-sounding games ever created, Infinite Dendrogram is a 13-episode VR MMO anime created by Studio NES that tells us about the adventures of Ray Starling, his blow-up doll nemesis, and the inevitable heat death of the universe. Tell me what, dear listener, do you even give a shit anymore? Look at him! Look at this fucking puss! Just seeing this kisser is already enough to guess where this all will go. You know, I'm starting to miss Grimgar of Fantasy and Dash. In fact, that should be some form of a test. Ignorance is thinking Grimgar of Fantasy and Dash is a boring torture porn. Despair is when you're sitting on the couch, watching Infinite Dendrogram and wishing you were watching Grimgar. And speaking of Grimgar, remember in that episode I talked about why people generally like isekai genre? It's because the main hero in those stories is usually a dork who's trapped in a place that either really wants him dead or just really bizarre, and so the audience can empathize with his struggle, building a sort of relationship with the character. VR MMOs, being an offshoot of the isekai genre, operate by the same principle, and the biggest problem with Infinite Dendrogram is that the main hero is shit. He barely struggles throughout the anime, gets cool items effectively from the start, most of his entourage or friends are either powerful people or living gods, and the saddest part is that there's barely any stakes save for the last episode, and even those get obliterated in the last episode. Yes, there's this whole is this really a game business, but that's merely a Chekhov's gun that's left virtually untouched by the end of the show. And speaking of that, after watching the show and thinking about it, I think I finally understand what irritates me the most about this generic Asian fantasy, and that is, for the most part, that as a world it makes very little sense. You know those typical Western fantasy worlds, the ones that are made by stacking cliché on a cliché and hoping it will somehow stick even though you can see the laziness just by lightly poking at it? In a typical Western fantasy, this usually takes the form of racial stereotypes, geography, naming, etc. In a typical Japanese, maybe even Asian stories, it takes the form of style mixing. Asian swordmasters are fighting steam dragons alongside cowboy-looking gunslingers armed with rocket launchers, or to make it more thematic, a scientist on a giant dragon is shitting out tens of thousands of monsters that are defeated by a martial artist and his futuristic bad battleship, while a paladin on a horse is trying to climb the dragon to talk to the scientist. None of these concepts make any sense or have a relation to one another. They are just thrown in there for the sake of rule of cool, and when everything in their pet goldfish looks like some final boss in other games, looking badass loses all credibility whatsoever. But so far I only shat on the anime. Are there any good points to it? Well, there are. Story-wise, it doesn't pull any punches, which is a nice addition to generally tame stories. I liked the class system. It's not that unique, being the typical job class system from Final Fantasy with a coat of paint, but there is something satisfying in actually making a conscious progression from a lowly soldier to an epic warrior of yore, and it's also nice that there is an option to skip it just by doing the requirements for higher tier jobs from the very start with all the consequences it intends. The idea that only one player in the game can hold a title of a superior job is an interesting one as well, as it helps generate players' lore. 72-hour account locking on death is something I'm a bit iffy about, but it's not something I would be against. It's also one of the rare occasions where the anime treats MMO like an MMO and shows that there are people who may not play the same sex as they are in real life. I think Look Horizon was the last time I've seen such a thing previously. The graphics are nothing special, there's an occasional animation fuck up and sometimes the lips are weirdly positioned on the model, but it's nothing too outrageous or worthy of attention. The music, like in previous anime, is one, maybe three songs that sound kinda the same. Unending monotony is the definition of a conveyor belt factory-made anime. Technically decent, plot-wise generic, and probably will ultimately be successful. This is anathema to beings like me who actually like thinking about the junk we consume, but I guess it's an adequate time waster if you have nothing else to do. And hate yourself.